Mark.
All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to move you all to a second monitor. So if you see me looking over to the side, I'm either looking to check on people or looking at my notes. And now I'm going to share my Lightroom screen. Okay, I'm going to start with a picture of a histogram rather than a regular picture, because I think it's important to understand how the histogram works, what it means, what it can tell you, because we'll reference it in other parts of the picture. But it's just a graphical way of seeing your picture in terms of how much of it is dark and how much of it is light and everything in between. So if you look on this far side here where it says blacks, this tells you right at this edge how much of the picture is totally black. And I have no idea what this picture is, but we can see that whatever picture it was, it had very little that was totally black, but it did have a fair amount that was dark enough to be in that range called blacks. It had a fair amount that was in that range that they call shadows. And then you have kind of the middle brightness of the pictures, and it's where most of the image was. And there really wasn't much bright about this picture. So we know this picture had very little that was really bright, mostly middle brightness and then darker stuff. Where this becomes important is it allows you to see things like if you have a big tall stack right here on the black side, you've got parts of your picture that are just totally black. And if that's what you intended, so be it. But if you thought you had some kind of shady areas and that people would be able to see into them if they had like a better monitor, if you printed it, or if you did things to enhance it, well, they can't. It's just black as black. And the same thing if you have stuff piled up here on the right side, it would just be white as white. And that's really important to look at when you're taking pictures and you look at your LCD screen and you can't see much, but if you go to the histogram, it can show you whether you're overexposing or underexposing. As long as you're between those two ends, you've got everything you need, and you can make the picture brighter or darker later, but you won't have lost anything. In the upper right corner of my screen, this is the histogram as it displays in Lightroom. And I know it's a little bit confusing. This is the histogram of this picture of a histogram. And you can see here, there's a tall stack. That's the stuff that's completely black, like these two spots here and these dark lines. Then this tall stack here, that's the stuff that says dark gray. And then you got lighter but still darkish gray. Then you've got a tall stack here that is this really light gray. And you've got some stuff right on the edge here that's the white. And you also have colors in the histogram. It's most important to look at it from a black and white perspective, but it does show you, okay, this area here is, I've got a lot of reds that are in the middle brightness. I've got a lot of greens that are brighter than my reds, some things like that. That's not that important. So let's go to a real picture and look at the histogram for that. So this is a picture with a lot of dark background. And so you can see the histogram is piled up along the left side because a lot of it is either totally black or very black. And then it's got a few lighter things. So one of the first things when people start to learn about histograms, they think, I want a histogram that's shaped kind of like this, goes up in the middle and tapers to the sides. That's not right. There's no right histogram. This histogram is right for this picture. This picture is exposed reasonably well. It's just a picture that has a lot of really dark stuff in it. And that's what I wanted when I took the picture. Here's the opposite situation. Here's a picture that's got a lot of really light stuff. It's got snow in it. And so it's got more stuff on the right side of the histogram. So don't try and find like the ideal shape, but just make sure when you're taking your picture, you're not all the way at one edge or the other. And when you're processing your picture, make sure that you don't pile things up on one edge or the other unless you want it to be totally dark or totally white. Okay, so with that said about histograms, let's start going through how you process a picture in Lightroom. You've got all these controls on the right side of the develop module and all these different sections. And they're sort of designed that you would go in order from top down to the bottom. You don't have to, you can skip around all you want, but logically you kind of start there. And I always start first with this one here called the crop tool. And I'll be honest, I never click on this spot here. I just press the R key that brings it up. I use hotkeys wherever I can rather than clicking things. So I use the R key, and this allows me to grab the sides of the picture or the top and bottom and kind of crop the picture to the way I want it to work. So if I don't need this much dark space around the picture, I'm going to come in a little closer, and I'm going to put this person a little bit front of center because I want to balance with the pot behind them, or a little left of center, I should say. Maybe put them right about there. It's a little, if you're used to using the equivalent tool in Photoshop, it's counterintuitive. In Photoshop, you're dragging the frame around, and in Lightroom, you're dragging the image around. You also have different tools, overlays you can use when you're cropping. Right now, this is one that divides everything into thirds. It's helpful if you want to follow the rule of thirds, which is to say you want your important things on these lines that are a third of the way through the picture, particularly on these points. I think people overwork that. It's a good guideline. So it's not a bad overlay to use. There's a grid overlay, and this one's useful more for architectural sort of things. Make sure you got all your angles right. You've got things, properly lined up. I'll be honest, I never use that one. The two I use are thirds and aspect ratios. This one is great if you're trying to figure out how much you can crop on a picture and still make certain prints. If you're not familiar with aspect ratios, that's just how wide is the picture compared to how tall is the picture. And the camera I used uses this outer aspect ratio, this 2:3. So in this case, it's 3 units wide and 2 units tall. That's the ratio. And so if I were to print a 4:6, that's an aspect ratio of 2:3, because you divide the 4:2, you divide the 6:2, you get 2:3. So it's sort of the proportions of it. A TV will have an aspect ratio of 16:9. A 5:7 print it draws on here. A 4:5 print it draws on here. So these lines would tell you if I came in and really cropped it tight so that I had this in the picture, if I printed this as a 4:5 or an 8:10, it would be this inner part here, and I would cut off part of this bowl or this cauldron behind the witch. In this picture, that might not be that important, but for other pictures, if you crop in too tight, you'll cut off things if people want to then make different size prints. And if you do work for other people or you do work for yourself and you don't know what you're going to print later, that can be an issue. The other thing that you'll see is if you're trying to use your pictures and post them on like a TV, which we use a TV for a digital picture frame, there the aspect ratio isn't any of these. It's a 16:9. So you would come here by aspect and you got whatever the original one was when it brought it in. But you've got choices. You can even make up your own aspect ratios. You can see some of the weird ones I've done. But 16:9, this would be how it would be on the TV. So you can see it's very wide for its height. You can unclick this lock and you can manually drag one side or the other and make it look different. And this is a useful technique. It's not that useful if you want to make prints because it's hard to find people who will print random sizes and it's hard to frame them and things like that. You have to do a lot of custom work. You'd have to be one of those maker types that could make your own frames for it. But it's useful if you've got like a panoramic picture. Imagine this is like a scene with a lot of mountains in it and stuff, and you don't want this endless sky above it. You might crop it really wide so you have this nice wide panoramic view. I'm going to go back to original on this. Another useful point is as you're dragging one of these edges, if you hold the Alt key down, when you drag, it drags from the opposite side at the same time. And so if something's already kind of centered, that's an easier way to drag it where you want it to be. You can also press the X key, and that will switch it from landscape to portrait or vice versa. And that's a useful tool. A lot of times I'll shoot things in landscape, and then later I see something that would be better as a portrait picture. Well, nothing stops you from doing that and cropping out the sides and making this a portrait picture. Now this one doesn't work well that way, so I'm going to switch it back, but I do that fairly frequently. That's a little tighter than I want. So that's the crop tool. One other thing about the crop tool is you can use it to adjust your angle if you end up with a tilt or something. If you bring the mouse over here outside the picture, you see those little arrows, you can use that to sort of drag it around. You also got this angle slider here you can drag around. But the most useful thing here is this little straighten tool. You click on that and you draw a straight line either horizontally or vertical. And get that. And it will just make that a horizontal line. So when you have good things to line up with there, you go ahead and use that. That'll allow you to crop it or angle it properly. Okay, so that's the crop tool. Now we're going to get into actually processing the picture, and you start with this basic section here. Or if anybody has any questions, feel free to jump in with questions. The first thing on
here. So what is this
here,
a production of?
this was the Phantasmic show at Disney World at the Hollywood Studios. It's a pretty old picture, and it was taken at ISO 1600, which for a camera that old was relatively noisy, as we'll see. I can take this and I can use it as a color picture or black and white picture. Now this one doesn't look very good in black and white. I'm not a black and white photographer. I'm not going to talk a lot about black and white. Just know that you can take pictures with your color camera and switch them to black and white. And there's some other cool things that you can do that we'll talk about a little bit later. Because it was a color picture, even though you changed it to black and white, Lightroom still knows the colors that are there. And so if you go use tools that adjust particular colors, it will adjust those even in a black and white image. And I'll show that when we get to it. The next thing here is the profile. Most are just going to, when you import, if you don't change anything, it's going to come in as Adobe standard. I use camera neutral, which if you browse down here, you can pick all these sort of different ones. I really wouldn't worry about that. It's kind of an advanced thing. And it doesn't make a huge difference. And it only occurs if you're taking pictures in RAW. So just let's talk about that for just a second, because that becomes important as well. Most pictures you see on the internet, most pictures that people use, the pictures that your phone takes, they're generally all done as a JPEG. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with JPEGs, but there's limitations to JPEGs. One is they only have 8 bits for each color channel. So the reds, greens, and blues only have 256 different values, all the way from totally black to totally white. And if it's a well done picture and it's not pushing the edges, that's fine. You're not going to notice a difference. But if things aren't right, if you shot it in RAW, where it preserves, for most cameras, 10 bits of color in each channel, you've got more flexibility. The other thing about a RAW image is, and that's what this profile does, is it brings back the numbers that the camera took for each color, but those aren't colors. They're just number values. And you have to have something that takes those number values and maps them to colors. And that's what this profile does. And the mapping can be very nuanced. And so you've got these different ways of doing it. And you may find that the portrait one's designed to make skin tones look a little bit better, and landscape one's designed to be able to handle greens a little bit better and things like that. So the differences are pretty small, but it's all in how it maps the colors the numbers the camera gives it for the colors into colors that are actually meaningful. And when you look at a JPEG image, you won't see these options. I think your only options are color and monochrome, because that mapping in a JPEG is already done. So that's a lot of words about something that you probably won't use much. So we're not going to come back to that. White balance you will use. You've seen, here, let me go to a different picture where it's more obvious. You've seen at the store, you have lights that are cool lights or warm lights. It's because they're different colors. they all look white to you when you're in the room and your eyes adjust to them, because your eyes are good at adjusting to different color casts. Things don't look orange to you in the sunset, but when you take a picture, they do. The lights in this house when I was in there, they didn't look orange, but compared to the sort of grayish light outside, they do. So the white balance tool is to help you correct, to get the light to look the appropriate color. And you've got options for that. You've got as shot, you've got auto. So this is whatever you set your camera to. And if you shoot raw, it doesn't matter because you can change it here. If you shoot JPEG, it does. You don't have all these options with JPEG. Again, you're limited to what you can do to correct your white balance. You can still do some, you're just more limited. Auto is just saying, all right, let Lightroom figure it out. But you've also got these, okay, it was taken during daytime, it was taken during cloudy weather. In this case, it was taken during, well, I guess it was taken during cloudy weather. It was taken inside by tungsten lights. So now the inside actually starts to look more neutral because these are white walls. And the outside looks bluish because the lights are just so different. That's what this white balance thing does. And it's also got this little tool here you can click on, and then you can go click on something in your picture that's white or gray, and it will white balance to make that a neutral color. So you can do that. One thing I'll caution you about is when people first start using white balancing, they think, oh, I'll use this to make all of my pictures white balance perfect. One, it doesn't work if you have different colored light sources like this. Now the inside is orange. If I make the inside look neutral, the outside looks blue. There is no right white balance on that. The other thing is you have to be careful. I started white balancing when I first got Lightroom pictures one by one by one, and I certainly wasn't that good. I don't think most people are. When you look at them later, all at a group, if the white balance was off sort of the same on all of them, you wouldn't notice it. But when you go through and you correct them, and you got one that ends up a little bit more blue and a little bit more warm and a little bit more whatever, as you're looking through the pictures, people will notice the difference in the white balance. Even if they were all consistent and they were all wrong, they wouldn't really notice it as much. But if they're close to being right but all different, they'll look different. So don't spend a lot of time trying to white balance every picture independently. Either set it the same for everything, or just leave it on auto or something like that. The other thing I'll caution you about white balancing is the world's not intended to be seen where everything is a neutral color. My favorite example of that is if you take a picture of sunset, you want that sort of warm light on people. You want that warm glow. And if you turn around and you make it neutral, well, then it looks like it's just a regular day. It doesn't look like sunset at all. And it looks funny, and it takes away the magic of the moment. So don't try and fix your white balance. Try and set your white balance to set the mood that you want in the picture. So for this picture, I could be trying to say something like, okay, look at how nice and warm it looks inside the house to a cool world outside. I could make the outside look cooler and cooler. I could make the outside look too warm, and then it looks like the house is on fire inside. But you just sort of set it to whatever makes you comfortable with the picture. So that's it with white balance. And you've got, in addition to the clicker, I was using these sliders here. You can manually drag these things up and down. And there's two. There's one that's from blue to yellow and one that's from green to red. And if we go look at this picture, you can kind of see why. It's this color wheel thing that comes up a lot. And it's got, in this case, it's got two axes. Or three really. You've got dark to light, yellow to blue, and green to red. And that's what the white balance is, letting you sort of move things. It's not trying to make the picture lighter or darker. It's just trying to move the color somewhere in here to make it neutral. 90% of the time, I just leave the white balance on auto and it's fine. Sometimes I will go through and bump it a little bit. If you go back to the library module, it's got these tools here that mimic the same thing on the other one, but I could select every picture and then I could adjust the white balance here. I could make it a little bit warmer, a little bit cooler. So it's not uncommon when I do a studio shoot like this picture here that's using flash, and flashes are almost always white balanced to be the same as daylight. I'll set up all the daylight, and then I'll come here and I'll just bump it up one click warmer. Why? Because people like that sort of warm light look on their face. It gives them sort of a tanner, healthier skin. Um, it's a nice look. Now, if you do it too much, then they look orange, and people might confuse them for the president or having a bad tan or whatever. It doesn't work as well. So, okay, let me go back to the develop module. So now you've got your white balance set up the way you want it. In this picture, it's fine. I'm not going to worry about it. Now you work on your tone settings, your exposure, your brightness. One of the first things to do is just click on auto and see what it does. On a typical picture, it'll usually do a pretty good job. But on a picture like this, it doesn't understand that I really wanted this picture to be mostly dark. So it makes it really light. You can now see background stuff that I didn't want you to see. And whenever you take a dark picture and you make it lighter, you'll see more noise. If we go back and talk about the histogram for just a second, when the camera is capturing values, it's got, just because of the way the math works, it's sort of exponential. It's got a ton of values in this white area and fewer values in this highlight area and fewer values in this midtone area and fewer values in the shadows area and very few in the blacks area. And so when you're adjusting it, it's got to take this black area where the signal to noise ratio is very poor, and it's got to try and lighten that up. And when it does, you're going to see a lot more noise in your image. So if you can, it's better to overexpose your pictures, as long as you're not so overexposed that parts of it are what's called blown out, totally white, and then drag the exposure down in Lightroom rather than underexpose and drag the exposure up. Because if you drag it up, you're effectively adding noise to your picture. If you drag it down, you're effectively removing noise. Now, the problem is, for a lot of pictures, particularly on sunny days and stuff, if you try and expose too much higher, I'm going to undo all this. It will, sorry, when you do undo, it undoes even moving between images and stuff. It keeps track of a lot of random things. Okay, so if you take a picture that's too bright and you have stuff in the white area that's blown out, if you try and make the picture darker, it can't bring any of that back. Totally white is totally white, and it doesn't know what to do with it. So you got to be careful not to have your histogram pile up on either end unless you want it to be totally white or totally black, or you don't have a good choice. Often if you're taking, say, a picture of somebody on a sunny, cloudless day, and they're sort of shaded, if you're going to get any kind of reasonable exposure to them, the sky is going to be totally white, and it just is what it is. Unless you can add light to them with a flash or something, you're not going to be able to fix that. You're not going to be able to expose it properly. Okay, so onto this. I can use my exposure slider here, and that, by and large, just makes the picture brighter and darker. Really, it takes the center section of the histogram, and it's mostly dragging it, but it can't drag it in a vacuum. Otherwise, you'd have the midtones be brighter than the highlights or darker than the shadows. So it's got to move everything with it. But it's focused more on the center section. And it's the first thing you do, usually focused on your subject's face. You'll move it to get your subject the way you want it. In this case, I'm just not that worried about it. It looks fine. Matter of fact, there's really nothing with the exposure that I want to change on this. So we'll detail that a little bit more. The one exception, and I'll come back to in a minute, is I'm going to want to drag the blacks down. But for now, I'm going to drag them up to emphasize another problem, and that is down here in this detail section, noise reduction. When you take a picture, there's always going to be some level of noise. And what's happening there is your camera is trying to record photons coming in, light cells, little pieces of light coming in. And every now and then it gets confused with just background electronics in the camera, and it registers a little bit of light that's not really there. And that shows up as noise. And when you've got a picture that's got a lot of dark areas, it's harder, you have fewer photons that will be there, and so the noise shows up more in the dark areas. Also, if you shoot at a high ISO, back in the era for this camera, 1600 was a high ISO. That's your camera's sensitivity level. The higher it is, the less light you need to take a picture, but the the more noise you'll get in your picture. So you see this, and I don't know how well this shows up on the video. Some of this might not show up well, but to me, I see a really grainy pattern here in the background that I don't want in the image. And so I can take this luminance noise reduction here, and I can start to slide it, and you see that grainy pattern sort of disappears and smooths out. The problem is, as I move this, watch the fabric here, it gets mushier and mushier. You know, I started, when it was way down here, I had a lot of detail in the fabric. Now, it's not useful detail. It's not like detail somebody's going to read, but it shows the texture of the fabric some. You can see that's like a velvet. But if I come up here, it looks more like a garbage bag. Um, and her face is losing detail and things like that. You can recover some of that, or you can fake recover by increasing your sharpening up here to balance back. See, it's starting to come back a little bit, but you really don't want to lose much of that. So you got to balance between how much noise do I want to get rid of and how much detail do I want to get rid of. And one thing I'll tell you is, you do your noise reduction at a 1-to-1 ratio. You zoomed all the way in. Let me so we got here the 1-to-1 we learned about last week, zoomed all the way in, or in that case, I think I had it even 2-to-1 so you could see it better on the screen. But you do that zoomed in, but when you're zoomed out, people won't notice that noise nearly as much. So don't err on the side of less noise reduction rather than more. And when you print it, I don't care how high resolution your printer is, inks tend to bleed a little bit. They tend to blend a little bit, and it's always going to look a little softer than your image on the screen does, and it's going to look less. You're going to see less noise on there. I've printed pictures that, when you look at a 1-to-1 ratio on the computer, look like they're just too noisy. They won't be very good. And they actually print fine. And if you went through and you got really aggressive on the noise reduction and you printed them, they would look worse because you would lose the detail in there. So use this noise reduction when you need it, but don't be excessive about it. And then there's two components. There's this luminance noise reduction, which just kind of gets out that sort of brightness stuff. But you'll also, and I'm going to bump up the exposure a lot just to create a fake problem here. You see, let's come back here to the detail. You get weird little color in here as well. So you can move this up, and that gets rid of some of the color noise. This isn't a very good example of this. This camera was actually pretty good at eliminating color noise, so it's not as big of a problem here. But those are two independent things. If you see lots of the same color dots, use the luminance slider. If you see lots of different color dots, use the color slider. And you can fiddle around with these detail and contrast and smoothness things if you want. Those help tune the algorithm for that. I tend not to get that particular on it. Okay, what I'm actually going to do with this image to fix this problem, because the noise is really in the really dark areas, I'm going to make the dark areas super dark, just black, and then I'll worry about the noise, and then my figure pops better. But you will see I've got this line here. So I've got parts of the picture that are totally black, and I may want to know what parts of the picture those are. And I can click on this thing right here, and those will light up in blue. Or I can click on this one right here, and anything that's too light will light up in red. By the way, you're seeing every now and then I reset these things. If you just double click on the name of one of these sliders, it will move back to whatever its default is. You can drag the slider itself, or you can also click on the numbers and drag the numbers around. I find that works better than dragging on the slider when I need to be precise. I can also, to turn these things on and off, I can hit the J key and that turns them both on so I can see what I'm doing. Normally, you would want to adjust this so you maybe just have a little bit of the picture that's totally black. You don't want to lose too much detail. In this one, I really want a lot of it to be black. Now, what I'm going to watch for is how much is black on my image itself, because I don't want too much of that. But in these dark folds of her outfit, that's fine to have that. So now that little bit's totally black, but I'm okay. Now the background's so black, I don't have to worry about the noise. So J key turns on your clipping indicators that tell you whether you're crushing your blacks or blowing out your whites. And that's useful when you're adjusting these things. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next image and show you some different settings with this one. Okay, start off with the crop tool. There's really not much I want to crop on this. If I do, I start to lose too much of the house. Do I want to make it level? Well, I've got a horizontal line here, but that doesn't look right. Let's go to the grid view. See, yeah, now, okay, this isn't right. So I've got a horizontal line or vertical line here I can use. But now that's not right. The problem is I wasn't looking at the house perfectly square, you know, right in the middle of the house, not looking up or down, anything like that. My perspective was off. And so I can't expect everything to line up perfectly because they didn't from the perspective I was looking at it. I can go to this transform area here and I can use this tool to do things like that. I can correct vertical perspective errors. I can correct horizontal perspective errors. I can use it to rotate like we did before, which isn't really going to correct perspective. I can use this to make things taller and skinnier or wider and fatter. It's unusual that I use these specific tools. More often, I'll use these presets. Full does everything to make it all perfectly square. And now the house, the lines are, the vertical lines are pretty much vertical, the horizontal, but it looks kind of weird. Full is often too much. Auto does a reasonable job of balancing things out. In this case, I think it mostly just left it alone a little bit. So it brought the building forward. You really don't want full a lot of times. Let's say you're standing at the base of a tall building and you look somewhat upwards and you take a picture. You know, the building's going to have that weird perspective where the top is a lot smaller than the bottom. And if you correct the perspective with full, now it'll look perfectly rectangular. But no, buildings look perfectly rectangular when you're standing near the bottom of them looking up at them. And so it'll look more like to the viewer, it'll look like a building that is falling over on them, because that's the only way it would look and have that perspective. So main point here is, again, you don't have to correct perspective entirely. You just want to make it look decent enough. For buildings, it's usually never full. Where I tend to use full is, let's say you're taking a picture of a framed painting and you tried to get it all perfectly square when you took the picture, but you didn't. Well, when you click on full, it will make it all perfectly square most of the time. Every now and then, I don't know what the hell it's thinking and it just does it weird, but that's when you can go to these tools. The one other thing I'll mention on here, and it's a little cheat, and you never tell anybody you've done this, but if you take a picture of a person who's standing in the picture and you use the aspect ratio and you slide it up to anywhere from about 5 to being really extreme 20. 20 is usually pretty noticeable. 10 is about as far as you can get away with it without them realizing you've done anything. They will look skinnier and taller than normal, and most people like that look. Now you have to be careful. If they're standing next to like a round clock, they'll look skinnier and taller next to an egg-shaped clock, which will kind of, you know, the jig will be up then. But if you just do that in some standing portrait shots, people will think, wow, you take a really nice picture. I look better in that picture than the pictures I take of myself. So that's a useful distortion cheat. Okay, we've already gone through white balancing on this picture. What would I do in adjusting it? I'd up the exposure some. I want it to be a little bit brighter, but I don't want it to be too much brighter because I want it to have that kind of overcasty look. If I make this look like, you know, nice sunshiny day, it's not the right feel for the picture. But I do want it to be a little bit brighter. I can also start to use these other tools here. These, like I said, exposure works on the center range. Highlights works mostly on this range. Whites I'm going to use. That's going to work on the brightest parts of the picture. And I'm going to bring them up to the, okay, I just turned on my clipping. You can see the lamp is blown out. That is what it is. I mean, you can expect it to be totally white. I'm going to bring this up until I see some snow start. Okay, now the sky is starting to clip. All right, so right about there, not like there was any detail in the sky to begin with, but now I still have a little bit of detail in the snow. It's hard to see on the monitor. It'll show up on a print better. Now my snow is going to look a little lighter, but I still have the full range of the picture. Often I will use the whites and black sliders to stretch my image so that I use the full exposure range. You'll just have a richer looking picture most of the time. There are a lot of times where there's nothing in the picture that should look white. And if you stretch something all the way to white, it will look weird. Or there's nothing in the picture that's all that dark. So nothing should be all that dark. So you have to be a little judicious with that. But using those to sort of expand that range, it's a useful technique when you're looking at, when you're going through your pictures. One thing, since I mentioned printing this, that I'll mention too, is as people start to adjust these things, and then they go and print their pictures, one thing almost everybody thinks is, why did my print so dark? If you go Google that, you'll see it all the time. And it's not the print that's dark. The print is always right. It's your monitor that's too bright. Almost every monitor comes set to be too bright for photography work. People like really bright monitors. They can see things better, just, you know, has more impact, but it makes it hard to then make your pictures look right for prints. So now if you're making your pictures to share with other people on the computer, well, you have to expect that their computers, not only are they not color calibrated, so your colors are going to be wrong, their monitor's probably going to be brighter than it should be, and so things are going to look too bright. I wouldn't get too focused on that, but if you do start to print, particularly if you print on your own and your pictures come out too dark, it's not what you're doing in your camera. It's not what you're doing in Lightroom or Photoshop. It's that your monitor is too bright and you need to dim your monitor some or calibrate your monitor so that it's more accurate. Okay. So let's go to a people picture so we can start talking about that. All right. So what would I do with a picture like this? Well, the first thing again is to crop. And let's go to the aspect ratios. And it's particularly important. This is a picture I did at a photo shoot. So I'm never going to print this picture for myself. I mean, I know this girl's mother, but I have no use for a picture for her. So I'm not cropping this for me. I'm cropping this for her. And I've got to make sure, I don't know what she's going to do with it later, but I have to expect she at some point might make an 8x10 print or 5x7 print. And I've got to make sure that none of the picture is going to be blocked by that. If I did crop it too tight for that, then when she goes to make a print, it's going to have borders on the side and it's going to look wrong. In this case, it's all white, so that wouldn't be as big of an issue because the borders are probably going to be white, but just be cognizant of that. That's why they have this aspect ratios thing in there. And it's very useful for that. Matter of fact, they didn't have it in the first few versions, and I was part of a group of people that lobbied, and they finally put it in there for us. So use it. Okay, so I've got it cropped. The next thing I want to do before I really get into the exposure is take care of a few, whoa, that's a little too much. A few facial blemishes. She had a pimple here and she'd scratched her forehead or burned it. I can't remember what the story was. And so I'm going to go use this spot removal tool. Again, I can click up here. I never do that. I always just press the Q key. Whoop, I'm going to turn that off for now. That's the zombie filter. And I'm going to adjust using the bracket keys, but I can also use the mouse scroll wheel. Adjust this to be just the size of the pimple. And I'm going to click on that, and it's going to go find someplace else that it thinks is similar, and it's going to use that to replace that. And there's two modes. There's clone, which case it will make an exact replacement, and then there's heal, which case it will look to that for the texture, but it will look for the coloring and lighting more for where it is. 99% of the time, you're going to want to use heal, not clone, particularly on people. Because you can see when I use clone here, if I turn the tool off, now she's got a little dark spot there. I turn the tool back on and select that again and go back to heal. You can't tell that anything was there at all. At least I can't. I don't have to just click. I can draw across something and create a little space here, and then it'll go find a similar space, and it'll heal that away. Now, if I turn it off and I want to pick it again, I got to click on that little thing. Every now and then it will pick someplace odd like that, and you'll end up with something like that. You're like, no. When that happens, just drag it over to where it needs, where you want it. It has a huge affinity for eyeballs. When you use this sort of the equivalent tool in Photoshop, very often you'll like get rid of a spot and it'll go, oh, you want a third eye there, don't you? I don't know why, but it does. Now I've got a few more little spots here. I can spend all day trying to, it's the hazard of taking pictures of teenagers, getting rid of all sorts of little spots here that you don't want to do that forever. So I just get rid of the big spots there, and we'll start with that. Now I'm going to start working on the exposure. So in this case, when I'm adjusting the exposure slider, I'm looking at her face, her skin. This is what I want to be. I don't care what happens to the rest of the picture for the most part. I want that to be properly exposed. Whatever's going to work best for what I'm trying to do here. And it's pretty close to begin with. Then I'm going to work on the rest of them. Contrast is just exactly what it says. You can raise or lower the contrast. Usually I find my default is to have about +10 contrast, just add a little extra contrast to the picture. Again, it depends on the type of picture you're taking. Some you want kind of a softer look, some you want a little bit of a harder look. This is one of those sliders though that does not survive well if you go to extremes. It just looks weird there and it looks weird there. Other sliders can handle extremes better. Contrast is best used judiciously. The highlights and the blacks on this, the highlights and the shadows on this, it's a studio shot. There really isn't a problem with those. I'm not going to adjust those, but I am going to adjust the whites. I just turned on clipping again. You can see this is all pure white here. I really want all this stuff to be pure white. So I'm going to start moving the white slider up, and it's just going to be getting rid of all the texture in there, anything else that I don't want. But at some point, it's going to start blowing out her teeth. I don't want that. So I'm going to back it off a little bit here. And now I still want to make this all white. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up here, and this is my adjustment tool. And again, I usually just hit the K key, but you can click on here for the adjustment tool. And then I can go here and I can set whatever settings I want. In this case, I want to take the whites and I just want to max them out. And I'm going to draw on the image, and it will do exactly what I did on there. And we'll use this more in other cases, but this allows you to take these settings and target them to just particular areas on the picture. It also has this really cool auto mask feature that if I were to go and do this right here, see it made her hair lighter? I didn't want that. So I'm going to undo that. But if I turn on auto mask, if I'm drawing on this white space here, it knows to only do similar things, and so it will leave her hair alone. So I can come up here and get close to the shadow and not hit it. And so now I've gotten everything I want to be pure white, pure white. I'm going to turn off the clipping indicator. So now it looks all white. Things look reasonably good. I'm going to bring my blacks down a little bit as well, but I'm going to watch her sweater, which is, let's turn the clipping on. Let's zoom out a little bit. Let's go all the way to where we start seeing some clipping, some blue spots. Okay, we'll bring it back a little from there. But I want to zoom in on her sweater. That's a little too dark. It's a little darker than that sweater really was. And I don't want that much of an extreme look in the picture. You know, that this is, because it's a very white background, it's called a high key picture. It's not intended to have anything really dark in it. So I'm going to bring this back up a little bit and get the sweater to kind of that lightish or that darkish deep brown that I remember it being. Okay, so now I've got my exposure set up right. Now I want to start doing some tweaks to her face. So we're going to come back to the targeted adjustment tool, the adjustment brush, and we're going to go use a preset that I have. You can save whatever settings you have on here, and you can use those as a preset. I've got one for teeth whitening. And somebody gave me a pack of a ton of presets, so I have a lot on there. I don't use that many of them. And now I can draw on her teeth. What I'm going to do with her teeth is two things. One is I'm going to make them brighter. I'm going to increase the exposure. And the other is I'm going to decrease the saturation. People's teeth generally have a yellowish tint to them, and they don't want that. So you lower the saturation some. If you lower it too much, it makes their teeth look a little gray, and that looks fake. The amount will vary based on the person, but usually -60 works for me. And I'll start drawing on her teeth. Now, part of the problem here is her teeth are already pretty white, and as I'm drawing on them, it's hard to see what I'm doing. So there's an overlay that you can use. You can come down here and click on it, or you can press the O key, and it will just show whatever you're drawing in red. Now, it's not going to be red. This just allows me to see where I'm drawing. And I've got auto mask turned on, so it shouldn't draw on her gums much. And it's helpful when you do this to start and stop a few times, because if you spend a minute drawing and then you make one small mistake, your only option to undo is to undo that whole minute of drawing. If you stop, then you can undo just that last little bit that you did between the last time you lifted your mouse button. Okay, so I'm drawing through there. Now I may have some areas here that I think I've gone a little too far on. So I can click down here. I've got brush A, brush B, and erase. And that'll give me a little eraser I can use to get rid of little bits of stuff that I didn't want on there. Now I turn off my overlay, and that's a little too bright. That looks more like a toothpaste commercial. Because, and you see this, so on a typical person's teeth, most of the time, 0.4 is going to work fairly well. When somebody has just had their teeth whitened for a photo shoot, it's too much. So I might knock it down to 0.3. I might knock it down to I could do kind of wherever I want in here. I'm going to go with 0.2. And I can click in here and I can just give it the number that I want. I don't have to drag if you start to know your numbers and how things look. Then I'm going to come along here and I'm going to zoom in tighter because I'm going to work on her eyes. I'm going to use the same exact tool. And I'm going to click on new so that I can change the settings of them independently. I'm going to use the same tool on the whites of her eyes. It's using the same principle. You want them to be lighter, and people's whites of their eyes often have red in them, and the saturation reduction will help get rid of some of that red. And so now her eyes look a little lighter, and it just gives them a little bit more pop to them. can see a little bit better. There's a before and after tool that I can use. Whoa, let's zoom out a little bit. And you can see kind of where we start, where we are. Her eyes have a little more pop to that. And I can do more with this. I can come here and I can use my iris enhancement tool. And this works better on some than others. Here, it's hardly doing anything. This is a setting that is increasing the saturation of her irises, and it's making them a little bit lighter. I might sometimes adding a little extra contrast. Okay, that makes it, now you can say she just got back from the eye doctor. Adding a little extra contrast sometimes gives them a little bit more pop to their eyes. Another one that I do is eyelashes, and this just does a little extra sharpness and clarity on the eyelashes. And it has the effect of, it's almost like putting a little extra mascara on it. Darkens their eyes a little bit. So it just gives their eyes a little bit more to them. So that's using that adjustment tool. You can go through and do all these little fixes. There's some other things though that we want to do globally. Like on this one, her skin still doesn't look as smooth as she would like it to be. I mean, she looks like a realistic teenager. And so we're going to try these presence tools now. They each do similar sorts of things. Texture is really about fine texture and sort of skin texture. And I can give her skin more texture if I just, if she was really obnoxious during the photo shoot, you just touch this up, she'll think that's how she actually looks, and she'll feel really bad. You can do this and you can make her look like an Instagram model, totally fake. You kind of want to find her what's the right balance. That's what texture does. Clarity is very similar, but it tends to work on, it's more of a micro contrast enhancement, but it has similar sorts of effects, but it's a little more extreme. And then dehaze, it's designed, if you take a picture and it's kind of a hazy day and you want to clear up the buildings in the background, it will do that by removing haze and adding haze, so you can make it look a little hazier than it was. And at the same time it does that, it sort of removes the blue from the haze, which is why the color's shifting on this, or adds some blue back in. I've never used dehaze on skin, but I have used it in other cases where I want to sort of soften things up a little bit. In this case, I'm going to want to use the texture tool, but the problem is I'm going to be watching her cheeks and her forehead, and I'm going to see, and I'm also going to be watching to make sure that it's not going too crazy. Oops, I want the texture to go down, not up. And because if I go all the way here, now it just looks fake. But if I bring it down to about 25, her cheeks now look sort of naturally textured, but they don't have that sort of I'm an adolescent with adolescent skin look, but her forehead still does. So we're going to come back here to the adjustment tool. I can double click where it says effect, and that just clears everything. I'm going to dial texture down, and I'm just going to draw on here. Now what I'm actually going to do, I'm going to dial texture way down, and then I'm going to use these controls down here. So the size, as I'm making the brush bigger and smaller, is just this size here. Feather, if you look at the brush, you notice it's got two rings. The inner ring says, I'm going to do 100% of what you put on there. And the outer ring says, anything outside of this is going to have no effect at all. And in between the two, it's going to have gradually less. And if you don't feather it, you'll see the edges of the effect, and it'll give away the fact that you did something there. So you want to feather it, and this allows you to decide how much you want to feather it. 90% of the time, 99% of the time, I leave feathering at 100. Flow determines how much of the effect is going to happen when I click it with the mouse, when I start moving around. If I've got my flow at 100, as soon as I click, it has 100% of whatever I was trying to do. and I don't want to hit it that hard. I want a little flexibility in there. So I'm going to bring my flow down, and that allows me to control it more. Density is similar to flow. People confuse the two of them. Density is the maximum amount of the tool. So if I set this to 36 and I set my flow to 100 and I click on it, it's still only going to give it 36. And if I click on it 100 times, it's still only going to give it 36. That's the maximum I said I wanted to let it have. Whereas flow, if I set it to 35 and I click it several times, it'll effectively be 100 by then. That's how much it's giving sort of per click or per drag. So I'm going to set my flow down fairly low. And now I'm going to kind of run over this until I get happy with it. Again, I don't want to make it totally go away or she won't look realistic, but that looks a little bit better there. Okay, then the last thing I want to do with this is clean up the spots on here. We got rid of the things on her face, but there's going to be spots on her sweater. There's going to be little bits of dirt on the ground. And so I go to the spot removal tool, which I got to by clicking here or pressing Q. And then I go to this visualize spots thing. And it makes the picture look freaky, but it makes the dirt stand out. So look at this little spot here. With this not on, don't even see it there. Now, if we zoom in, and I hold down the space bar while I'm zoomed in, it turns into a hand I can drag over there. I can see, oh yeah, there's a little spot there. Then I can pop it with the tool and it goes away. So let's go back to visualize spots. And then and you got to be careful, like, okay, that looks like it's probably actually supposed to be there. But this was that little bit of fuzz that was on her sleeve. This was a little thread that was on her sleeve that was kind of wrong. That's actual contour. Here's a spot. Here's a bit of dirt. You could spend all day doing this if you want, cleaning things up. Whoops. You know, the more you zoom in, the more you'll see of these things. Let's go ahead and turn this off, and we'll zoom in on some of the spots we cleaned up. And you can see one of the really cool things is it cleaned it up, but it also took care of the pattern. You know, if I move this out of the way so you can see what it was before, there's the little bit of dust. But when I fix this, it also fixed the pattern so that it blends in. It's really cool. So you can sit here and clean up specks of dust forever. We're not going to do that. Yeah, I think that's everything I want to do with this picture. So that gives you a sense of the picture. I can come here and I can do the before and after. And we can see kind of how, let's go back to, yeah, let's make this 1 to 2. So this is how, and then I can even go through here and I can spot remove the little nose piercing ring if you want to send this to her grandmother who's going to be offended by that. I honest to God, took a picture, photo shoot of a lady with her kids out in a bunch of wildflowers, and she was wearing ripped jeans because that's the fashion, and her mother hated it because her jeans were ripped, so I had to go into Photoshop and patch her jeans for her. So you laugh at things like that, but they're true. The other trick with this stuff is, what do you do when somebody has a scar? You don't know whether that scar is something that they're proud of, they like, or whether it's something they're embarrassed of. I just ask. Nobody wants a pimple. You can just wipe those out, or a scratch or something like that. But scars, most women do not want their scars showing. Men tend to. And then women have those weird beauty mark things, the little, yeah. I never know what to do with those. Okay, let's move on to another picture and some more settings. So this is a dragonfly picture. And we're just going to kind of rework this picture and see what we can do to make it a better picture. Right now, the most obvious problem is the dragonfly's small in the picture. I just have all this blank space. And a lot of what you're doing when you're working a picture is you're telling the viewer what your subject is. You want them to see the subject and focus on that. So having a dragonfly that's small in the picture doesn't serve my needs. I want to have the dragonfly be bigger in the picture. I'm going to have it a little up high. So I've got it kind of where I want it. I want to increase the exposure on this a little bit. I'm going to move this up to about 0.6, get a little bit brighter. I want this to be a little contrasty, so I'm going to go up to about 25. I want it to have a little extra pop, and it's also surreal to begin with. It's not going to make it look unrealistic. Nobody gets up that close to a dragonfly to see what's realistic and what's not. I'm going to do that trick about stretching the blacks and the whites. So I'm going to turn on my clipping indicators, and then I'm going to go bring my whites up. I don't really have any whites in this picture. Oh no, I'm on the wrong tool. Never mind. I'm going to bring my whites up. Really not much that I want to do with the whites. I want the blacks though. I want the dragonfly's dark areas to be as dark as possible, just touching on being too black. So now I've got a punchier dragonfly. Next thing I want to do is use these presence tools again. I'm going to go crazy with the clarity slider on this one, because if I boost this clarity way up here, you really see the wings pop. The problem with it is then you see the leaf pop, and the leaf is there to support the dragonfly, but I don't want the viewer I don't want them thinking that's part of the picture, so to speak. So I'm not going to use the clarity slider. I'm going to go back and use the tool, the adjustment tool, and I'm going to clarity the heck out of this thing. And I'm going to turn auto masking off because I'm not really worried about it spilling over. I'm going to turn my flow all the way back up. And so now it's just like adding textures, just making it really look scary, cool. I want to do the same thing, but on the opposite to the leaf. I'm going to take this brush and I'm going to turn on the overlay tool. I'm going to make this stuff look less clear. You know what? I'm going to undo that. I'm going to turn on my mask on this one because I don't want this to spill over. And I'll explain why in just a second. So the problem with having the mask, auto mask turned on is it's going to miss spots in here. You see I'm having to go over areas multiple times. Since I'm really only worried about the edges, I'm going to turn this off and come through here and just make sure that I catch everything and let the, okay, that's good. Now we'll turn the overlay off. I'm going to make this less sharp, and I'm also going to make it less saturated. And I'm going to dim it a little bit. No, darkening it actually gives it more presence. Lightning does. So I'll leave the exposure alone, but I'll leave it with less saturation, so it's got less color and less detail. And so it's going to draw your eye even more to the dragonfly and not to the leaf. Okay, the next tool I want to use is this radial filter. This is just like all these other adjustment tools. This one works by creating a circle. And it's actually an oval. You can make it circular, you can make it whatever. You can adjust it to make it a little more oval later. You can hold down the Alt key and bring one side down without affecting the other. These aren't the settings that I want though. And by default, it's a little bit counterintuitive. The adjustment is going to affect outside the circle rather than inside the circle. If you want it to affect inside the circle, you click on invert, and you can do that. But typically, we're going to do it for the outside of the circle. And one of the things I'm going to do here is I'm going to darken this whole image, except for the dragonfly. Now I'm going to lighten the whole image, including the dragonfly. And by doing this, my dragonfly is going to stand out more. It's going to have almost like a glow behind him. So if we do like the comparison, you see the dragonfly was sort of a flat look behind it. Now it looks like there's a glow behind the dragonfly. Again, it's all about drawing your viewer's eye right into that dragonfly's face, getting a good look at it. So that's the radial filter. The one that I have, the few that here that I haven't done with is one is red eye correction. If you take a picture with a flash that's too close to your lens, typically a flash on a cell phone or a flash on a point and shoot camera, it'll bounce off of the back of your subject eyes. You can use this tool to draw on their eyes, and it will get rid of the red on them. And then this graduated filter, let me go back to the regular view. The graduated filter, you draw in from one end and it will filter from that side, and it draws two lines. It's pretty much 100% of the filter to the first line, and then the filter fades away to the second line. And the gap between the two is based on how long you drag it down. So if I just drag it down a little bit, I have a small feathering area that I could then drag the dot down and cover the whole picture. If I drag it down a lot, that feathering area gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And I can actually turn around and drag most of this away. I'm not going to use this for this. Most of the time I use this for skies, to just dim the sky some, bring a little, adjust the sky to look a little bit better. So that's the last of those tools. You've got the one where you can draw whatever you want. You've got the one where you draw a circle and it's everything inside or outside the circle. You've got the one where you're coming in from one edge. And they don't have to be straight. You can make your edges like that. Those are the ones that do these adjustments. You've got cropping, you've got removing spots, you've got red eye. Okay. Let's jump down to the HSL group. This gives you the ability to adjust hue, saturation, luminance. You can look at them one at a time. If you got space on your monitor, I'd just leave it set to all. And you got sliders on here. So what do they do? I can take a given color, in this case, like this green here, and I can adjust its hue, so I can make the green yellower or bluer. This is a tough picture to show this on because everything's pretty much the same color. I can adjust the saturation so that I can make the greens less saturated or more saturated. And I can adjust the luminance so I can make the greens lighter and darker. Imagine a picture with a blue sky, and it's the only thing that's blue in the picture, and you want to make the sky a little bit darker. You would just grab the blues and drag that down. Instead of guessing at the color to drag, though, you can just click on this thing here and then click on part of the picture, and it will adjust the colors of whatever you clicked on. In this case, the one thing that I do want to adjust is the little bit of aqua colored stuff on the dragonfly. I want to make that stuff freaky saturated. Let's see what happens when I adjust the, I want it maybe a little bit lighter. Again, it doesn't have to look the way a dragonfly really looks. I just want to look cool. And then I can play with the hue to see, do I want to make it a different color? Certainly don't want to make it more green. it'll make it a little bit more purple. So it's just affecting the little turquoise areas around the dragonfly. Again, let's go back and look at the before and after. It's hard to see because we made so many changes, but it's punched that up a little bit. Okay, that's pretty much what I wanted to do with this image. So let's move on to another one. I'm using the arrow keys to move between images. You can, typically you would have this film strip up and you would be clicking on pictures there as well. I just want to do it this way. Oh, this is one where I wanted to show you guys two images, and I wanted to show you the difference between two controls we haven't done, vibrance and saturation. These affect the colorfulness of the image, and they both do the same sort of thing. If I move the vibrance all the way up, you can see it's kind of an extreme view of colors. If I move it all the way down, it's practically black and white. Let's move it all the way up. Then let's go to the next copy of the same picture, and we'll move saturation all the way up. And now let's go look at them side by side. And this is the one that had saturation, and this is the one that had vibrance. Let me try and explain this and make it clear because it's a little bit confusing. Saturation just takes all the colors and it keeps making the colors more and more or less and less saturated, and it does it all them equally. Vibrance does the same thing, except that for the colors that aren't very saturated, it does more to them, and the colors that are very saturated, it does less to them. And what that does is it sort of helps keep your picture from going into like cartoon mode, where the things that are already pretty saturated become way too saturated. And you can see that here where the greens here are just crazy green now, and here they're still somewhat under control. And the oranges here are a little crazy orange. Here they're a little bit more under control. It's not that vibrance does less than saturation, it just focuses its energies on the parts of the image that aren't all that saturated to begin with, and leaves the ones that are very saturated more alone. So that said, I use vibrance 90% of the time. No, 98% of the time. I don't use saturation very much. The only time I use saturation is where I want something to look unrealistic. I want it to look too saturated. So that's the real difference between those two. Now, one thing I can do, going back to that hue saturation stuff, is I can punch this up. It looks nice and saturated. There's too much color in the picture, but it doesn't look too crazy. But I can come down here and I can grab those greens and I can lower the saturation of those. That's a little too much, but right there. And I can darken them as well. And now my butterfly pops more. I keep saying pops. You really want your viewer to look at your picture. You want them to, you want their eye drawn to whatever it is you're trying to get them to look at. It can be multiple things in an image. It can be one thing in an image, but you want that to be what they look at. And the tools that you use on that are depth of field. You want your subject to be sharp, and the things that you don't want them to be paying attention to be blurry. But that's generally done when you take the picture. But that whole enhancing with clarity and texture and sharpness, stuff like that, that draws people's eyes there. Just like when we were doing the eyes on the girl and we put sharpness in her her eyelashes. Again, it just makes it, you see more detail there and draws your eye to it. People's eyes are drawn to color, so you want more color on where you want your viewer to look, if it's appropriate, and you want to take away color from where you don't want them to be looking. And then they also like bright things in the image. So you generally want to darken the parts of the image where they're not looking and lighten the parts of the image where they are looking. So those are just tricks to make it easier on your viewer to see what you're trying to get them to see, to make the subject sort of pop out for them. Okay, enough of bugs and things like that. Let's just go to a picture of, okay, this is where I got problems because of the film strip. I had those two pictures selected, so as I keep going right, once it gets to the end of the selected pictures, because there are multiple selected, it went around to the first one. Okay, so we're going to do this kid playing soccer. Now, first glance, you look at it and think, kind of a nice pose, but a crummy picture because you got all this dead space, the exposure's not good, stuff. We can make this work. First thing we're going to do is crop. We're going to crop in. Now, I'm going to do this to make a 5x7 print of this kid. No, I'm going to make an 8x10 print because I'm going to make the picture look nice. So I'm going to come over here and go to the 8x10 thing, and that allows me to crop in tighter. Now, if I do crop in this tight, if somebody does a 4x6, yeah, they're going to cut off a piece of his hand. So I wouldn't crop this tight for a picture I was going to give a client that may print in different sizes. This is when I'm cropping to make a print. I'm going to crop in as tight as I want, maybe a little bit less because frames are designed to come in a little bit over the picture to hold it in so you don't have gappage. And I wouldn't want the frame to come over his hand, but I want it as tight as I can be without losing anything. Now, he's underexposed, and one of the things you'll notice right away is you think, dude, aren't you supposed to stand on the sunny side and have them lit by the sun? Why are you standing on the shady side and shooting them that way? The sunny side people are wrong. They're wrong for two reasons. One, when you as the photographer stand with the sun at your back shining on your subject, when your subject's looking at you, they're going to squint. Their eyes are going to get smaller. In this case, it's not relevant, but in a regular portrait, and their eyes aren't going to look as good. The other problem is you're going to be more likely to have shadows on their face. When I say shadows on their face, his whole face is in shadow. That's okay. I can work with that. But if half of his face is in shadow, it's a pain. I can play around with the shadows and highlights here to try and get it closer so it's not as bad, but it'll never look good. By having him completely in the shadow, I can work with that. I'm going to increase the exposure and get his face kind of the way I want it, which is going to be pretty bright. I'm going to put it all the way up. Actually, first, you know what? Let's see what auto does with this picture. Yeah, I kind of like some of the stuff it did, but it still left it way too dark. So let's leave everything it did, which a lot of these are like crazy looking settings, but let's just make it brighter. Let's bump it all the way up to about, that's a little too much. Maybe right. Here, I'll just type it in. 1.3. Now his face looks good. The rest of the picture is a little brighter than I'd like it to be, but his face looks good, and that's what I want. Now, I can do my trick with pulling the blacks down. How down do I want them? I think that's good. Just, it gives me a richer looking picture. I go from more light to more dark on there by doing that. Now, I can use that hue saturation stuff to play with the grass. Again, nobody cares about the grass. Let's desaturate a little bit. And look at that. The grass isn't green. The grass is green and yellow. So if I just grab the green one, I wouldn't necessarily have gotten it right. I'll do the same thing. I'm going to lower the brightness of the grass. Now, if I go extreme, it looks weird, but I can bring it down some. And now I have less of an issue with it. It doesn't look as bad anymore. And now the last thing I might want to do to draw people's eyes, and this is so easy to overdo, so I want to be cautious with it. I've got these effects down here. And the first one is post-crop vignetting. I can make the edges of the picture darker or lighter. That's if you're trying to make a wedding invitation, it's the only time you use that, I think. And I've got different ways I can play with this. I can work the midpoint, which kind of controls, so this one's controlling how dark, and this is controlling sort of how far in to bring the darkness and the roundness of it. I never mess with that. And the feathering, how, if I don't feather at all, so you can see the exact edge. So what I did is I just put together some presets that work for me, sort of my light, medium, heavy, and then very heavy. So that's when you're just going for an all-out effect. Heavy still is a little heavy-handed. Light, you hardly notice it. Medium's good there. So what did that do for the picture? Let's do the before and after. It gives it a little darkening around the edges, which just sort of draws your eye into the middle. Draws your eye again to your subject. Whoops. So now we have a picture that started well, it's cropped already because we're kind of cropped in, but it started all wonky looking and not very useful. Now it's kind of a fun picture. So as long as you've got everything between the goalposts that you need, and yeah, I blew out his hair a little bit, but that's okay. He's got blonde hair. He's fine. Um, you can do a lot with Lightroom to fix exposure issues. The one thing you can't fix is blur, motion blur. If you shook the camera during the picture, you're hosed. So if you're on the edge thinking, boy, I need a faster shutter speed, but if I do, the picture's going to be too dark. I'd rather have a picture that's too dark that I can lighten up and reduce noise so than a blurry picture. Blurry picture is pretty much useless. Okay, that is the last of the pictures I want to show. I just want to quickly run through a few things that I didn't cover. One is tone curves. This is just like using these exposure sliders, except that with a tone curve, it's the histogram all over again, and I can grab parts here. So this is on the bright side of the picture, and I can drag it up to make it lighter. I can drag it down to make it darker. I could grab the dark side of the picture, make it darker. Maybe I want to. So it just gives you more fine control over those things. I use curves a lot in Photoshop. I never use it in Lightroom. I mean, maybe 1 in 5,000 uses do I touch the tone curve. Other people swear by it though. So split toning, that allows you to adjust the hue of the bright parts of the picture. If I wanted to make the bright parts look redder or whatever, differently than the dark parts of the picture, I might want to make them look cooler. Rarely used, more of an effect thing, but it is what it is. Oh, I promised to show you something in black and white. Let me do that now. If I'm in a black and white picture and I think, ooh, yeah, this would be better if his jersey was darker, I can go to that hue saturation. They changed his name to black and white, but I can drag his shirt up to make it lighter or down to make it darker. And you notice it's got the colors labeled there. And you go, what are those colors? It's a black and white picture. It's just looking at the color that was there before I converted it to black and white. And so this section here is really useful, and you'll use that most if you're taking a black and white picture, again, to work on the sky, because usually the sky is the only thing that's blue, and it allows you to darken your sky up to make it contrast with the clouds more, or just do things like that to make it pop more. Now, I don't work in black and white, so I don't know. Yeah, that did leave his orange looking funky. Oh, no, it didn't. We just already had it that funky. Okay. Lens correction. Let's go to lens correction. It does two things. Oh, I actually have an image to show one of these. Took this with a cell phone. Cell phones are notorious for having chromatic aberration in areas where you have bright stuff and bright highlights against other things. You get these color shifts. And it's kind of hard to see in this, but there's blue in these things. Often you'll see purple fringes on your picture. That's the most telltale sign of chromatic aberration is purple fringes. In this case, it's blue fringes. You could click on this. If it's purple fringes, it'll remove them. In this case, it really didn't. But I can go to this manual tab here, and I can just grab the eyedropper tool, and I say, okay, get rid of that. And now, see the blue went away from there? It's a little hard to see. But all these little blue fringes got cleaned up by that. The other one on here you can do is enable profile corrections. Let's go all the way out to the, so what does that do? If it knows your camera and your lens, it can fix geometric distortion. See when I click on this, the middle sort of pops out more. That's actually more reality. And this was the camera lens distorting things. It will also fix, some lenses have vignetting. Almost every lens does at different apertures, but it'll make the edges a little darker than they should be. This will correct for that. When I first had this, I turned it on by default. You really don't want to do that. You want to use it to correct problems. If it's not a problem, don't use this. And the reason why I say that is every one of these pixels here shifted, it moved, it got tweaked a little bit, it got blended. You lost detail and you lost quality when you did that. Not much, but what benefit did you get from it? Now, you take a picture of a building with straight sides and your camera pin cushions them a little bit or barrel distorts and makes those straight sides look a little curved. Yeah, by all means, come here, click on that, let it fix it for you. Then they'll look straight and they won't look funky. But if nothing looks wrong, don't go correcting it, because everything you do to your image, particularly anything that moves pixels around, you're going to lose some information, even though you're fixing it. Okay, another thing to mention on here is synchronizing settings. This isn't a good set of pictures to do this with, but let's say that I had just made that these are all pictures taken at the same event, all outside, all in the same light, no clouds came over. I adjusted the white balance, got it the way I want it. I can go to, I have to find it in the menu. Let me select all the pictures. Maybe. No, maybe. Yeah, I just remember Control Shift S. That's why I never go to the menu for it. But if you do that, if you do your Control Shift S, I guess I have to be in the develop module for that. Oh no, I don't. It just popped up on the other screen. Can you guys see this pop-up window? Can you see this pop-up window? Okay. This allows me to say, okay, for whatever picture I selected first, copy these settings to all the other pictures. So if I set my white balance, I could check that, and then I say synchronize, and it would put that same white balance on every picture. If I wanted to, if I had a piece of dust on my sensor and I clean that piece of dust out of the sky on one picture, I'm going to clean it out on every one of the 100 pictures I shot. I would go to the spot removal and I would synchronize that across all my pictures. So it's a way to just take whatever work you've done on one picture and synchronize it across a bunch. Another useful thing is, let's go to one of the pictures we worked on. Let's go to the dragonfly one. I have a history panel here. Remember what I said last time that one of the cool things about Lightroom is it doesn't change the pixels, it just records all the steps you did. These are all the steps you did. it shows you every change you made, and you can go back through here. You can say, you know what, I want to go back to this step and not have everything that I did after that. And now you can start working again from here. I don't know that you can adjust these steps independently. Let's try it. Let's change the clarity. What is this? Clarity -3. Let's be honest. Oh, I took 3 away from it to make it 0. If I boost my clarity now, okay, yeah, it gets rid of all the history above that. So I guess you can't go back and edit something in time, but you can go back and see what you did and go back in time. You can also take a snapshot. I'll be honest, I've never used, but that saves like whatever settings you have, so you can go back to that particular set. So you may do that when you get it kind of looking one way. I mean, you want to try a completely different look, you create a snapshot of it, and you can go back to that snapshot if you didn't like the changes you made. Virtual copies we talked about last time, but it's important to talk about those again. I can create a virtual copy of an image. Whoops, I created a virtual copy of every image, but same point. When I created that virtual copy, let me go back to the develop module. It has no history. It just starts where it is, but I can make whatever changes I want to it. I can make this one black and white, and now I have the same image stored once on the disk, but it's got 2 different sets of instructions on it. And it's got this little symbol here that tells me it's a virtual copy. And I made a virtual copy of everything for this class, except for the stuff that I downloaded to use. Okay, and then the one last thing in the develop module I want to show you that I never use is this calibration section here. This allows you to, oh boy, this would be useless on a color, black-white picture. Adjust the way the camera sees its different colors. Man, I wouldn't mess with this stuff. The one part that you might mess with is this process here. Lightroom has had 5 different processing engines during its lifetime. Every time it comes out with a new one, that becomes the default. But when I opened up some of these pictures that were 10 years old, they were process version 3. And so things work differently then. Let me look for, I'll go to process version 1 because that'll be even more extreme. In process version 1, you didn't have whites, you had recovery. And you didn't have shadows and highlights, you had fill light. And you had clarity, but you didn't have texture. So that was the way it was done back then. The only reason why I'm pointing this out is if you have an old picture in Lightroom that you had there for a long time, you can change the process version to the new version to be able to make whatever changes you want. Your old changes, it'll map as well as it can. It won't be perfect, but that's the only time you would ever use this. So that is everything I wanted to cover on the develop module. Did I miss anything anybody was expecting to see? Does anybody have any questions about anything that I showed? Oh, wait, I did miss, I showed you these presets that I did. Anytime you've made some changes to a picture, you can come over here and you can click on create preset. You can tell it what changes you want to save. And then those changes will be saved in a preset, and you can apply those same changes to any picture you want. So if we go back to our soccer player, and I want to apply my user preset for slimming him, I can make him look a little taller and thinner. I can make it hard to notice, and I can make it easy to notice. But you notice the ball here no longer looks round. There you kind of get away with it. Those are just presets that I saved. These are presets. Yeah, this is a preset that I saved that whenever I import a picture, it applies this preset. And to me, that always adds 10 to, I use, I set my, my profile to camera neutral. I adjust my vibrance and I adjust my contrast a little bit. Camera neutral is, it tries to preserve the most neutral image, but as a consequence, it's a little under contrast and a little less vibrant or saturated. So I adjust for those. So that, I think, is everything I wanted to cover. Now, any questions?
I was playing around with the, I got in here kind of late, sorry about that. But did you cover dehaze? That's kind of neat. I was looking at that. I'm not sure exactly what it's doing, but it makes the pictures look neat.
So what dehaze does is, the intent of it was when you have a picture where you have a lot of moisture in the air, and so distant objects tend to be, they have a bluish cast, they lose contrast, they're a little lighter. It adds in extra contrast and it removes some of that blue cast. And for a picture where you've got like mountains in the background that are a little bit lost in haze, you can bring that down and it makes it look like it's a clear day, gets rid of that haze. You can use it in a negative way and you can add haze to a picture. Usually you wouldn't use it for the whole picture. Usually you would use it with this graduated filter. So if I had, again, the top of the picture was kind of hazy because there were mountains off in the distance, I might put it at like 45 and then drag this and drag it down, and that would remove the haze from the mountains or whatever in the background on the top of the picture. So it's a pretty cool tool.
Might be pretty good in shadow areas, right? Where you get a lot of blue from the skylight, you know.
Yeah, I have tried that. That's possible.
Huh.
Yeah, it can be, shadows can be a really interesting thing. When you bring up the shadows, that just fixes the exposure level on them. It doesn't fix color casts. And I learned that when I took pictures at like a golf tournament and people were wearing caps, and it was at noon, which is a terrible time to take pictures. And when I got in, I thought, oh, their faces are in shadows. I'll just bring up the shadows. The problem is their faces were lit by light bouncing off of the grass onto their faces. And so when you bring up the shadows and expose their face properly, their faces are green. And so then you're stuck with a green look to it. Now, in newer versions, you couldn't do it then. You can paint, one of the adjustments you can paint on there is white balance. So you can remove some of the green cast there by dragging that in. So I haven't done that. Now I've known golf tournaments to either ask people to take their caps off or to use a flash to fill in that light. I mostly just avoid golf tournaments. What else?
I also avoid golf tournaments.
One other thing I'll say, just a lot of times if you're involved with if people want to have like a photo contest, a lot of times they're going to have rules on there saying no editing. And it irritates me to no end. I can understand no editing in the standpoint of adding, like, if there was no ball here, I shouldn't go to another image and add a ball or go add a logo on or something. But being able to adjust things like the exposure, things like that, to me, that's not editing the picture. That's part of the creative process of getting the picture, because no picture is unedited. Every camera is going to add saturation. It's going to add contrast. It's going to make adjustments on its own before you even get the image. That's even true with a raw image. It's not truly raw. And so if you say no editing at all, what you're really saying is you have to do all your editing with the settings on your camera. Matter of fact, now some cameras allow you to take a raw picture and adjust the settings there while you're in the camera. So that's a little of my soapbox thing on the whole no editing thing is cameras don't take pictures of reality that you then want to show the exact reality there. They take pictures applying all sorts of edits and filters and then give it to you to apply more. And if you're shooting video, professionals shoot video using a log format that's specifically designed to be unsaturated and low contrast and stuff, because they want to do that under their control in post-production and not have the camera do the editing for them. So don't feel like if you're using Lightroom to do some of these things, you're cheating. You're just doing what the camera would do, but you're doing it under more controlled circumstances. All that said, don't get lazy when you're taking your pictures and think, I'll just do it in Lightroom. It's usually easier to get it right in the camera or get it more the way you want it in the camera. But there's times when it either doesn't, or it's not convenient, or it's not right, or you can actually get a better image. Like I said, if you've got room and you can overexpose your picture without blowing anything out, if you do that and then you lower the exposure, you will get a better picture. That's less important now because you'd only be overexposing it if you had plenty of light, and cameras at low ISO now don't have a lot of noise. But when digital cameras first came out, they were noisy even at ISO 100. So.
Yeah.
All right.
That shoot, well, professionally, nature stuff. And the nature magazines, all that sort of thing, they have some really strict rules about what kind of editing you can do.
So that's a good point. When I talk about editing, if you're trying to represent reality, you got to be careful with what you do there to not overrepresent things. So I have a picture, I don't think I can find it quickly. I have a picture of a Victorian crown pigeon from the zoo, and it's a beautiful bird, but I maxed the saturation on that thing out to an extreme, and it looks like this spectacular, brilliant, vibrant, still looks real, but it's just amazing. That's not the way those birds really look. So if you're doing a nature magazine, you did that, yeah, that would be a lie. That would be distorting it. Now, could you do what I did with this? I don't know. It would depend on the magazine, but generally there, you're not doing anything that's not real. You're just enhancing the visuals on that.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
And I will say,
graphic moving pyramids and stuff.
For nature stuff, half of the nature pictures you see are blatant lies. My favorite is a class I went to on shooting hummingbirds. And when you see a hummingbird sucking out of a flower on like a magazine cover with this beautiful blurry background behind it stuff, what you are seeing, and I'm not making this up, is somebody who's taken a picture and printed it and stuck that behind a hummingbird feeder, and that's that background. They have trained the hummingbird to come to the hummingbird feeder, and then they've put a flower over the end of the thing. So they're eating from the hummingbird feeder through the flower. So it's a real flower there. And they've got 2 flashes on the background to make sure the background's lit nicely. And they've got about 5 flashes set up for where that hummingbird is, because the more flashes you have, the shorter the flash duration, because flashes, they have one brightness level. All they have is how long they're lit. So if you want to have to capture a hummingbird whose wings are beating really fast, still, you need a lot of flashes. So no flash has to be lit for very long, and that'll freeze that picture. So that hummingbird that looks beautiful in nature is actually flying through a gauntlet of flashes with a background to its side, and it's sipping out of a hummingbird feeder through a flower. But that's what you see for those hummingbird pictures. And for a ton of these wildlife pictures, there's things like that. How do you bait the animals to get them into the right situation? How do you set up the lights? How do you do all that? So the same thing with nature documentaries. When you see the storyline unfold, they're cutting together footage of a lot of different time periods, put into one. Nature's not that convenient that you can really see the storyline unfold that way.
Oh, wow.
All right. Well, unless anybody's got other questions, I think I'll wrap up the presentation. Thank you all for coming. And
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks you.
Kathy will get this
man.
posted on the YouTube video. So.
Sorry I'm late. I was working on a computer for my granddaughter, trying to fix it up. And I didn't, how that goes. lose track.
Always takes longer than you think it will.
Yep.
Well,
So you can
that's-
watch it in its entirety in a few days.
oh,
Probably